Donald Trump has a confusing history on climate change. Up until 2009, he was known to occasionally support actions against greenhouse gases. But since then, he's fully embraced climate change denialism, among other things famously calling it a hoax fostered by China. In this denialism, he is, of course, joined by many powerful Republican politicians. In fact, just this past Tuesday, in preparation for his announcement, he met with his recently appointed Environmental Protection Agency Administrator, Scott Pruitt, a long-standing and vocal climate skeptic. In his Senate confirmation hearings, Pruitt stated, quote, "Over the past 2 decades, satellite data indicates there has been a leveling off of warming," end quote. This has been a consistent talking point among powerful climate change skeptics. For example, here's Senator Ted Cruz from about a year ago.
I would note this chart on the right, which shows for the last 18 years that there's been no significant warming whatsoever.
It's these claims that have led a team of scientists to publish an official rebuttal recently in the journal Nature Scientific Reports. Dr. Ben Santer was the lead author of that paper. He's a climate scientist at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, but wants us to make it clear that today he's talking to us as a private citizen. Dr. Santer, welcome to Quirks and Quarks.
Thank you, Bob.
Now, I'm going to ask you about your thoughts on Trump's pulling out of the Paris Agreement, but first, why did you feel it necessary to write an official rebuttal to EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt and Senator Cruz's claims about the climate satellite data?
In my opinion, when incorrect scientific statements are elevated to the level of formal congressional testimony, the scientific community has a responsibility to set the record straight. That's what we tried to do with Mr. Pruitt's claim, and that's also what we tried to do with the earlier claim from Senator Cruz that you mentioned.
Where are they pulling out these numbers, like 2 decades and 18 years, to say there's been no significant warming?
The satellite temperature record is 38 years long. It started in late 1978, goes through to the present, and it shows warming of roughly now 0.2 of a degree Celsius per decade. So a total of nearly 0.7 degrees Celsius over the full period of the satellite record. And superimposed on that overall warming trend are a lot of wiggles. And if you're a climate scientist, that's what you do. You study those wiggles. One of those wiggles is back in 1997, 1998. It's a warm spike associated with a big El Nino. On average, El Nino events, which are natural fluctuations in the climate system, tend to warm the planet. And that one was one of the biggest El Ninos of the 20th century. So this is classic cherry picking. If you go back 20 years from the present, you hit that warm spike in 1997 and 1998. And the name of the game, I'm sorry to use that word, but that's actually what it is to choose a high point for the starting point of your trend, march forward in time 20 years and argue, well, there's been little change over this one artfully selected period. Even the last 20 years, even if you do that artful selection, there's still significant warming over the last 20-year period. And indeed, if you look at any 20-year period in the 38-year satellite record, pretty much all of them show that there's been significant warming. And that's one of the things that our paper shows.
Well, has there been any period of leveling off or a reduction in warming that you could tell?
Well, there are natural decade-to-decade changes in warming rate. They're not a scientific surprise. They're expected behavior. There are internal fluctuations in the climate system, things like El Niños and La Niñas and other what climate scientists call modes of variability, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation, Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, a veritable zoo, if you will, of these natural fluctuations in climate. And they wax and they wane, and if you look at changes over short periods of record, you can have trends that bounce around a little bit. There are also volcanic eruptions in the last 38 years in the satellite record. Big volcanic eruptions tend to cool the planet down. So if you look at the record, you see this background warming trend that I mentioned, 0.7 of a degree Celsius over the full 38-year record. But you also see these ups and downs, these wiggles So it's expected, again, to see as you march from decade to decade. But the key thing is there's this inexorable warming signal in the background there over the full satellite record. And indeed, if you look at surface thermometer records, you see that inexorable warming signal too.
So I'm trying to picture that. If we were to make a graph of the warming, it's not a nice, smooth, even curve. It's more like a sawtooth with ups and downs and peaks. And if you can choose one spot, you say, well, look, it's going down here. But you're not looking at the whole picture. If you back off and see the whole thing, it's actually still on the rise.
That's right. So what I do and what my colleagues do is you look at the long view. You try and reduce the effects of year-to-year natural fluctuations in temperature by taking the long view. If you only look at a very short, artfully selected piece of the record, you don't see that. The noise kills you, and you don't see the signal. So it's silly. It's foolish. In the same way, you wouldn't look at the minute-by-minute record of day trading on the Dow Jones Industrial Index to make long-term inferences about changes in the Dow. You wouldn't do that.
Well, given what you know as a climate scientist, how do you feel now that President Trump has pulled out of the Paris Agreement?
I feel very sad. For the last 9 months, I have argued in the public arena that a U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement would have serious negative consequences for this country and for our planet's climate system and for our ability to deal with the problem of human-caused climate change. So President Trump decided on June the 1st, on Thursday, to take the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement and let the rest of the world move forward on their own to deal with a problem that we largely created. The United States is responsible, historically speaking, for the lion's share of emissions of greenhouse gases. So I feel sad. I feel like we've missed an opportunity to be leaders, economic leaders, moral leaders, political leaders. Other countries will assume that leadership role. Canada will, Germany will, China will. We are turning the clock backward. We're going to try and make the horse and buggy great again. That's not a smart business decision. You know, Mr. Trump prides himself on being a very shrewd businessman. The decision he took to remove the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement will be the single worst business decision of his entire career.